In 1897, during the construction of a new courthouse in Eastland County, Texas, the county clerk, Ernest E. Wood, thought it would be interesting to place a time capsule within the building's bricks. However, this clerk had a sense of humor. He placed a Bible, some newspapers, a bottle of fine wine, and lastly, a live horned toad, captured by his 4-year-old son, into the time capsule.
What?
Fast forward 30 years, the old courthouse was demolished, and a public event was held to open the time capsule in mid-February 1928. 1,500 people gathered in Eastland, Texas, to witness the opening, mainly to see the fate of the horned toad. At precisely 4:07 p.m. on February 18, 1928, the time capsule was pried open. A worker reached into the box and pulled out a flattened, dust-covered toad. The judge took the toad, held it by its hind legs, and raised it for everyone to see. Suddenly, the toad's hind legs twitched. Oh my God, is the toad alive? The news of a toad surviving 31 years of confinement in Texas made headlines in many major newspapers, including the New York Times. The report stated that the toad initially appeared dead. However, after a short time, it opened its eyes, and about 20 minutes later, it began to breathe. However, its mouth seemed to be stuck shut. For the first time in history, the scientific community debated about a toad. Some argued that the toad's survival for 3 decades, isolated from water, sunlight, and oxygen, was impossible. Others asserted that it was possible. The locals in Eastland had a simple, yet hard to dispute, explanation. The toad's miraculous survival for 31 years was due to the presence of the Bible in the time capsule, which had blessed it.
Yes!
This story is entirely true. The horned toad was named Ulrip and is currently on display in a small coffin at the Eastland County Courthouse. This is not the only or the first story of its kind. According to an internet article, there have been over 210 reported cases of frogs and toads found in rocks, coal lumps, or large tree trunks in Europe, the United States, Canada, Africa, New Zealand, and the West Indies. The earliest case dates back to the late 15th century, and the most recent occurred in the early 1980s in Australia and New Zealand. In some stories, the toads were witnessed by more than one person, such as the 1928 event in Eastland County. Therefore, it's clear that the legend of buried toads cannot be merely imagination. Some key details are frequently repeated in these stories, regardless of the time period. Their eyelids are covered by a mucous membrane, their skin is darker than usual, and their eyes are bright. What is the truth behind this phenomenon of toads in rocks? During its heyday, there were many specimens of toads in rocks displayed in museums worldwide. However, most have been removed due to their lack of credibility. The only remaining toad in a rock currently resides at the Booth Museum of Natural History in Brighton, England. It's the image you'll most likely see when searching for the keyword toad in the hole. Actually, if you search for toad in the hole, you'll find a British dish consisting of sausages baked in pudding batter. But back to the toad in the rock. This specimen was donated to the museum in 1901 by amateur naturalist Charles Dawson. It consists of a hollow, oval-shaped flintstone containing a dried toad. Dawson recounted that some workers noticed the stone was lighter than usual and broke it open to investigate. The stone contained a hollow cavity that seemed to have formed around an ancient sponge. This cavity connected to the outside through a narrow slit, which was once the stalk of the sponge. You can still see this narrow slit on the specimen. Dawson reasoned that the toad crawled into the hole through this slit when it was very small. It lived in this hole, feeding on small insects and larvae that tried to crawl inside, just like it did. After a while, the toad grew too large, became trapped, and eventually starved to death in its stone prison. Dawson suggested that most stories of toads and frogs in holes and tree trunks happened in a similar way. It sounds convincing, but there's a problem, a very serious one. The name Charles Dawson is associated with one of the biggest scandals in the history of science. He was the perpetrator of the most infamous scientific fraud of all time, the Piltdown Man hoax, in which he forged a human-like skull to create the missing link between humans and ancient apes in Darwin's theory of evolution. In the 2003 book, The Piltdown Man Hoax, Dr. Miles Russell exposed Dawson's numerous scientific frauds and plagiarism over 20 years. All of Dawson's fake discoveries were shocking and astonishing, like the Piltdown Man and the toad in the hole. The dried toad itself also betrayed him. Later photographs showed that the toad had shrunk considerably, indicating that it had died not long before being brought to the museum. It seems that when Dawson found a suitable flint stone, he dried a toad to stage his hoax. Another point exposing Dawson's deception is that if the stone were near a stream or a damp place for the toad and its food to enter, why didn't the toad decompose and rot after death? But just because Dawson was a professional scientific fraudster and his specimen was a hoax doesn't mean that the phenomenon of toads in rocks is entirely impossible. In the 1820s, British geologist William Buckland conducted an experiment to see how long toads could survive when encased in stone. He placed toads in stone boxes sealed with glass lids and then buried these boxes in his garden. A year later, he dug them up and discovered that most of the toads were dead and decomposing. However, the only ones alive were in porous limestone boxes with some cracks in the glass lids, which he believed insects might have entered to provide food for the toads. To test this, Buckland buried them for another year. This time, none survived. He concluded that toads could not survive in stone for long periods and that reports of buried animals were false. A plausible explanation for the toad in the hole stories is that a toad was accidentally near a hollow stone that broke, and people mistakenly believed it fell out from inside the stone. When you think logically, if toads in rocks were real, why haven't any new ones appeared in this age of rapid information dissemination, with millions of geologists and collectors digging up fossils and minerals day and night? In the 1928 Eastland event, there's no basis to assert that someone staged it. Amidst the crowded chaos of thousands of people, a skillful hand slipped a fainted toad into the time capsule and pretended to retrieve it from inside. But at least it's easier to believe than a toad surviving 31 years in a brick thanks to the blessing of the Bible. Or maybe we're underestimating the survival capabilities of animals. We're familiar with bears burning fat to survive the winter. This is traditional hibernation, where bears still wake up and wander in their dens between sleeps. However, some animals slow down their metabolism to such a low level that you'd think they were dead. This fish is an example. It's a state between life and death, like the animal pressing the pause button on its life. And one of the kings of this discipline is the wood frog in North America. Bears prepare for winter with hearty meals, while wood frogs prepare by holding their pee. They produce a lot of urine but store it in their blood instead of excreting it. No, I'm not mistaken, and you didn't hear wrong. Wood frogs cope with temperatures as low as -16 degrees Celsius by producing their own antifreeze. They do this by mixing urea from their urine with glucose from their blood. This antifreeze prevents too much water from being drawn out of the cells, which would cause cell death. With this formula, wood frogs can survive with 2/3 of their bodies completely frozen. At this point, the frogs enter a state of near-suspended animation. Their metabolic rate drops almost to zero, their lungs stop working, and their hearts stop beating. After 7 to 8 months, they thaw as if nothing happened. In theory, wood frogs could suspend their lives by maintaining this frozen state for many years, even decades. But 31 years in a brick, do you believe it? Leave your comments below. Remember to like and share the video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.